Some of the scariest true crime stories are ones that are rarely told, either because they're too heartbreaking or simply because they slipped under the radar. Today, I've compiled a list of several lesser-known true crime stories, most of which you've probably never heard of before. So, here are 5 of the scariest true crime stories ever told. Toronto, Canada has a meager crime rate as compared to other cities and even countries. That's because the community is ready to step up and help others in need, especially in terrifying times. For instance, in mid-2016, a man was saved from getting attacked by a hammer-wielding assailant by his young neighbor. But just a year later, there wouldn't be anyone who could save a 22-year-old Tess Richey, and she would ultimately meet her very tragic end. Tess Richey was looking for a way to distract herself from a terrible and recent breakup, so she decided to meet a friend at a bar for a night out. Little did she know that she was about to be driven straight into the hands of death. The case of Tess Richey is a prime example of evil being in plain sight and how 2 events separated by just 1 year can coincide on one fateful night and cause utter devastation. Tess Richey was born on November 30th of 1994 and grew up in North Bay, Ontario, Canada. Tess was the youngest of 5 daughters and the apple of everyone's eye. Being the youngest, according to her sisters, she was spoiled rotten. But despite being the family princess, she was an extremely down-to-earth, humble, and caring girl. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind and had a very generous, outgoing, and cheerful personality. Tess was an avid animal lover. Her 2 dogs, Phil and Pearl, were her life. And can we just pause for a second and acknowledge how great of a name Phil is for a dog? I gave my tiny dogs a grown man's name too, and this is Carl, and Hank is in the other room. But anyway, Tess was a loyal and very protective person of the people that she loved. She also had a green thumb, and she loved to plant trees and had a vast collection of houseplants. She also worked as an assistant manager at the local Days Inn in North Bay. And when she turned 19, she moved to the metropolitan city of Toronto, with dreams of pursuing a career in service and eventually traveling. Tess wanted to work as an air hostess in an airline, and when she moved to Toronto, she enrolled in the flight services program at Seneca College and graduated by April of 2017. After graduating, Tess applied to multiple airlines and even upscale hotels to get her dream job. She also juggled several part-time jobs, including working in a Toronto coffee bar. Tess, still waiting to hear back from the airline job she applied for, decided to pursue another career on the side, and that was related to languages. Tess learned Italian and was seeking job opportunities as an au pair in Italy, which is basically a live-in nanny situation. Tess, being an ambitious young woman with lots of dreams, also started a YouTube channel, and she primarily talked about her experiences of being in abusive relationships, advocating for women's rights, and she even posted some music cover songs. Tess was a fierce and strong woman who wanted to create a safe space for women in the same boat as her, women who'd survived difficult relationships. Tess wanted to help others and wasn't afraid of sharing her vulnerable experiences with her online community. The last video Tess posted on YouTube was on February 23rd of 2014, and it was about being in a relationship with an abuser. Even from the video, you can tell that Tess was a mature young woman who knew what she deserved. Her way of addressing such an unfortunate and life-altering topic was inspirational for other women. All in all, Tess was a beautiful young woman with so much to look forward to. In November of 2017, everything was about to change for the worse though, and Tess was about to experience just how vile and sinister some people can be. On November 23rd, 2017, just a week before her 23rd birthday, Tess was going through a rough patch in her life. She'd recently broken up with her boyfriend, Julian, and was feeling understandably down. Knowing that her family, especially her sister, would be there for her, Tess went to visit her older sister Rachel in Midtown Toronto on November 24th, which was a Friday. Rachel was Tess's source for comfort and support. Rachel wanted her sister to start feeling better again, but since the breakup was still fresh, Tess was inconsolable. She wasn't eating, and Rachel had to persuade her to eat something, anything. Rachel tried to pacify Tess by talking about the breakup with her, distracting her with shopping and spending some much-needed quality time together. Rachel also cheered Tess up to some extent by taking her to her favorite place, the dog park. Tess was feeling a lot better, and she was even cracking a smile and laughing, which Rachel was relieved to see. Rachel and Tess spent the majority of the afternoon together because later that evening, Tess had to meet up with an old high school friend named Riley Simrad. Fast forward to about 11:30 p.m. Tess called an Uber to go meet up with Riley. She said goodbye to Rachel, who saw her sister running down the stairs to catch the Uber. Little did Rachel know that this would be the last time she would ever see Tess again. Tess had plans to meet up with Riley at a downtown drag bar called Cruise and Tangos, located on Church Street. And when she arrived and was waiting for Riley to show up, Tess texted Rachel at around midnight to let her know that she'd arrived at the bar safely. Now, this was something that the sisters would do a lot. Tess, being the youngest, was always looked after by her older sisters, and they'd made a pact to let each other know where they were, especially if they were going out alone or at odd hours. After receiving Tess's text, Rachel was at ease and just let her enjoy her night out. The following morning, on November 25th, Rachel texted Tess at about 8:45 a.m. to ask about her night out, but she didn't get a response. Now, Rachel wasn't alarmed or scared at this point, as she knew that Tess had a long night and that she probably was sleeping her exhaustion off. But when 6 p.m. approached and Tess still hadn't heard back from Rachel, this began to worry her, and she was prompted to check Tess's movements through a Fitbit account that the sisters shared, and the Uber account that was linked to their mother as well. When Rachel saw Tess's activity on the Fitbit account, she was very concerned and very confused. She found out that Tess had walked about 300 steps at around 3 a.m. Rachel then discovered an Uber ride that was requested at around 4 a.m., but what's so confusing is that this was canceled by the driver, suggesting that Tess likely never made it home. All of this information terrified Rachel to no end, and 22-year-old Rachel was reported missing on that same day. Now, Canada is a relatively safe country, and its crime rate is way less than that of the US, so it was alarming for the Toronto police to see that a young woman had gone missing with such bizarre clues left behind. An official investigation was launched, and the investigators knew that time was ticking away. If Tess was out there in danger, then the police had to find her quickly and return her safely to her family. But that wouldn't happen. There were very limited leads in the case, and as hours turned into days, the Toronto community felt even more anxious and scared for Tess. Tess's family, including her mother and sisters, also joined the search. On November 27th, almost 2 days after Tess was reported missing, her family made the 4-hour drive from North Bay to Toronto with flyers in their hands to join the search for Tess. They were holding on to the sliver of hope that Tess would be found alive and safe. And meanwhile, detectives also searched the Church Street and Wellesley area, but there was no sign of Tess. After 4 long days of searching for Tess, which was the equivalent to an eternity for the Richey family, Tess's mother, Christine, and her friend discovered something horrible. It's something that a mother should never have to witness. On November 29th, just a day before Tess's birthday, Christine and her longtime friend, Anna Brazo, a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital, decided to look around the Church Street and Wellesley area again, as this was the obvious place where Tess was last seen. They reached a house that was closed for renovation, with a narrow stairwell that went to a basement door, about 2 doors down from where Tess was last known to have been. While walking past the building, which was actively under construction, something caught Anne's eye, and she stopped to look at the end of the staircase. She immediately noticed a woman's lifeless body at the end of the stairs, and she called out for Christine. When Christine approached the stairs and took one look at the scene, it was as if her world had completely stopped. Christine had discovered her missing daughter. Tess was no longer alive. Generally, in true crime cases, it's the police or a random passerby who discovers the body of a missing person, and then the family is informed of their beloved's passing. But this scene was truly tragic, and it's hard to imagine the thoughts that must have been going through Christine's mind when she discovered Tess, for whom they were praying and hoping to be alive and well. This scene completely crushed Christine and the Richey family. And stumbling across something like this, that image never leaves your mind, never. That's the type of image that 20 years from now, you're out having a great night with friends and family, then all of a sudden, the image pops back up in your mind out of nowhere. These are scars that truly will never heal, and it's beyond devastating that Tess's own family had to witness this. What was even more infuriating was that this place was searched by investigators just a couple of days prior, meaning there are two possibilities here. Either the police 100% didn't search the area like they claimed they did, or someone had placed Tess's body there after the search had been completed. Regardless of which scenario is closer to reality, Tess's body had to be taken in for an autopsy, and initially, the police ruled Tess's death as an accident, as there were no visible signs of trauma or struggle on Tess's body. But on December 1st, 2017, the autopsy revealed something entirely different. Tess's cause of death was neck compression, which is in line with strangulation, so it couldn't have been an accident. Moreover, male DNA was found on Tess's clothes. This was the point where the case took a turn, and was investigated in light of a possible homicide. But the detectives and the city of Toronto still had many questions. Like, who would try to do something so heinous to Tess? Was it someone close to her? And what happened on the night that she went to the Cruise and Tango's bar? Well, the answers to these questions would soon be revealed. The police, having no possible suspects, turned to the CCTV footage of that fateful night and tried to piece together a timeline of events. Luckily, the CCTV footage in the neighboring areas, as well as the bar where Tess went, provided a breakthrough in the case. See, the surveillance footage showed that Tess was walking hand in hand with an unidentified man shortly before her tragic demise. The investigators also decided to question Tess's friend, Riley, who was with her on the night of the attack. Riley said that she and Tess had a lot to drink, so much so that the bar security asked them to leave. CCTV footage showed Tess and Riley leaving the club at around 2 a.m. The girls then walked to a hot dog cart on Wellesley Street, where they interacted with several people, including a woman outside of her house and a man who proceeded to accompany the girls from that point onwards. The woman, named Michelle, was later interviewed. She said that she talked to Tess and Riley while smoking a cigarette outside of her home. Tess confided in Michelle about her recent breakup, and Michelle comforted her for a short while. Turns out, Michelle really liked Tess from the get-go, and had even given her number to Tess if she ever needed to just talk to someone. After this encounter, which lasted about 20 minutes, Riley received a text from her boyfriend at around 4 a.m., asking her to come home, at which point Tess decided to call it a night and call an Uber back to the house, further corroborating the activity Rachel found on the app. So it was Tess who requested the Uber, but she never got in it. And this begs the question, what happened to Tess during this time? Well, this is where the surveillance footage showed more of what happened that night. Riley's story was confirmed because at around 4:02 a.m., she was seen walking away from Tess, heading towards her own home. But Tess wasn't alone. Remember the guy that accompanied the girls near the hot dog cart? Well, he was with Tess when Riley left for home. This man and Tess proceeded to walk to 582 Church Street and down the staircase where Tess would later be discovered on November 29th. The staircase was out of the surveillance camera's frame, but 45 minutes later, the man was seen again, walking in the opposite direction, very close to the fence in a slow strut. He was alone, and Tess was nowhere to be found. This revelation shocked the police, who knew that this man had something to do with the attack on Tess. But there was one big problem. Detectives didn't know who this man was. But it wouldn't be for too long, as the man in question would soon come to the police. See, after the grainy footage of the man with Tess was released to the public, the police received a phone call from a man who claimed to be the guy in the footage. But who was he? And why was he with Tess on the night of her attack? And did he harm Tess? Kalen Schlatter was a 21-year-old man living with his parents and younger brother in North Toronto. Friends, neighbors, and family described Kalen as a sweet and caring young man. He didn't have a criminal record, and in fact, he was considered a town hero. A year prior to Tess's tragic passing, Kalen had saved his neighbor from being attacked by an assailant with a hammer. He'd heard a scuffle between a man wielding a hammer and his neighbor, and when Kalen intervened, the attacker took off running. The local TV station even interviewed the man about his helpful efforts to keep the community safe from crime. After the phone call, the police called in Kalen for an interview, which he went to with his parents and his lawyer. But Kalen's behavior took a complete 180, as he was uncooperative and even refused to give his DNA. Well, it turns out that the police didn't have to struggle for it, because Kalen's own parents would unknowingly help them out. See, Kalen's parents had brought their son some water and snacks, and Kalen even took a couple of swigs from the water bottle before discarding it. The police retrieved the water bottle and sent the DNA off of it for testing. About as simple as it gets. A couple of days later, they hit a jackpot. Kaylin's DNA matched the DNA found on Tess's body, putting Kaylin at the scene of the crime and holding him accountable for whatever happened to Tess. Kaylin was immediately arrested and held in a cell. And this is where things get very confusing for everyone. Kaylin was considered to be a gentleman in the community. So why was his DNA found on Tess's body? Well, looks can be deceiving, and something very dark lurked beneath Kaylin's happy and chirpy facade, which would soon be uncovered. Kaylin's cell was located beside that of two other criminals who were actually undercover cops. They were disguised in hopes of getting a confession out of Kaylin. And well, Kaylin wasted no time in revealing a lot of disturbing details about himself. Kaylin boasted about his charm and claimed to be a ladies' man who knew, quote, how to seduce women. He also went on to brag about being with over 40 women despite his relatively young age, which was extremely alarming if it's true. Kaylin's phone was also confiscated, and it revealed a lot of dark things. It turns out that Kaylin was interested in some incredibly violent sexual acts, and watched loads of, well, explicit videos. This revelation was further solidified when Kaylin's ex-girlfriends were questioned. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of what they revealed to the police, but they confirmed that he had some very unique interests, some of which were violent. If that wasn't eerie enough, a closer look at the bar's CCTV footage showed Kaylin present at the bar at the time Tess and Riley were asked to leave, meaning that he may not have met the girls at the hot dog stand, as detectives originally believed. He may have been stalking them. The footage showed Tess and Kaylin a mere shoulder's width away from each other, which is so creepy to think about in hindsight. Even though Tess and Kaylin didn't interact inside the bar or even know each other beforehand, one thing was clear. Kaylin had his sights on Tess at that point. Kaylin also confessed to the undercover cop that Tess was alive when he left her at the staircase, but he soon changed his story and said that he was inebriated and didn't remember what had happened that night. With all of this information, on March 21st, 2018, the investigators upgraded the charges on Kaylin from second degree to first degree. Finally, almost 2 years after Kaylin was arrested, his trial was scheduled for January 12th of 2020. Kaylin's attorneys argued that Tess's attacker was someone else, even naming this person in court, and they stressed that Kaylin had nothing to do with Tess's passing. But the prosecution was 2 steps ahead of the defense. They'd already questioned the suspect in question, and he was cleared of any suspicion. Kaylin also took the stand in court and explained the reason why his DNA was on Tess's body. Kaylin claimed that he and Tess bonded over their mutual breakups after meeting on the street outside the bar, and Tess was highly engrossed in the conversation, so much so that she even ignored a phone call during that time. But the prosecution slammed this story shut very quickly because Tess's phone records showed no incoming calls on the night of her tragic attack and passing. So Kaylin was essentially lying, but he wasn't done. Kaylin proceeded to claim that Tess had initiated the flirtatious advances, and the two had kissed for a bit before Kaylin, well, got excited, and he claims that this is how his DNA got onto Tess's body. But there was no evidence to support this claim. During his confession, Kaylin claimed that he invited Tess to his house, but she refused, saying that they couldn't go any further, and asked Kaylin to leave, which he did. He repeated the fact that Tess was alive by the time he left, but the prosecution didn't believe Kaylin's web of lies because if Tess were alive at that time, then she should have gotten into the Uber, which was canceled by the driver because Tess failed to show up. It was suspected that Kaylin had somehow convinced Tess to go into the dark alley and that he then tried to make advances on her. When Tess refused, this hurt Kaylin's ego, and he proceeded to then subdue Tess, take advantage of her, and ended up strangling Tess with either a soft cloth or his cloth-covered forearm, which could explain why there weren't any ligature marks on Tess's neck. The prosecution also showed the jury the amount of surveillance footage, along with the statements of Kaylin's ex-girlfriends. The prosecution also called another witness, a fellow cellmate of Kaylin's, from a Toronto correctional facility, where both men were held in 2018. The cellmate, known publicly as ES, testified in court that he initially felt sorry for Kaylin, as he was a young man in jail for the first time. But as time passed, ES started noticing very bizarre things about Kaylin. Kaylin would cry himself to sleep, but not due to the guilt of robbing a young woman of her life. Rather, it was because he didn't want to serve a long sentence for killing Tess, and that he missed his mother. What was even more maddening was the fact that during a tearful testimony delivered by Tess's sister, Rachel, who expressed feelings on seeing Tess for the final time, Caylen was listening to everything with a calm and stoic expression, and his face was devoid of any emotion. Caylen was terrified to tears of having to face consequences for what he did to an innocent woman, but he didn't even flinch when Tess's sister was breaking down in court, reminiscing on the final moments with her sister. The cellmate also went on to testify that Caylen confessed that he lost control when Tess refused to go, quote, all the way with him. And in a fit of rage, Caylen strangled Tess with a scarf. On the other hand, Caylen denied having any conversation with this ES person and repeatedly tried to claim his innocence, which is beyond infuriating. In the end, Caylen's trial lasted about 6 weeks, and after deliberation, the jury came forth with their verdict. On March 23, 2020, Caylen was found guilty. The trial of Tess's murder was emotionally jarring for the Richey family. In the end, Caylen was sentenced to 25 years behind bars, a slap on the wrist compared to what happened to Tess. Christine had not only lost her daughter on that fateful night of November 25th, but her family had been scarred forever. Tess was the light of their lives, and Rachel, being the last person to spend time with Tess, couldn't even anticipate that she would never see that beaming smile of her sister again. It's just so heartbreaking to see what the Richey family went through. The Toronto police also made a huge mistake of not searching for Tess's body more carefully. Tess's body was found in an area where the police had already looked, but they failed to locate her, and her body had to be found by her own mother, Christine, who's now traumatized for life. She explained the scene as similar to looking into a grave. Now, I'd previously mentioned that it was possible that Tess's body wasn't missed by the police, but that it may have been moved there after the fact. But the courts were able to conclude that this simply wasn't the case. Tess had been there the whole time, and investigators just didn't look closely enough. Due to the negligence of police during the search for Tess, 2 officers, Alan McCullough and Michael Jones, were charged with 2 counts of misconduct and neglect of duty in June of 2018. The police officers failed to comb the area and didn't even bother to interview the neighbors or notify a supervisor on what was going on. Shockingly, the 2 police officers are still part of the police force, although they did receive penalties for their neglect in the search for Tess. The Toronto police have failed to provide more information regarding this action, which is all the more frustrating for the Richey family. Christine, while reliving the terrible memory of finding her daughter's lifeless body, accused the police of misconduct by stating, quote, if they'd followed protocol, they would have found her. She was lying just around the corner. The Richey family is still reeling from this painful loss. Tess was the baby of the family, and although she was everyone's favorite, she was someone who would help anyone and not hurt a single soul. According to Christine, Tess was made of everything good in the world, and why Caylen, a stranger, would even attack a loving and caring person like Tess remains a mystery to this day. It seems like Caylen was yet another example of a person who couldn't take no for an answer and desperately wanted what he couldn't have. The Richey family went through a lot with Tess's passing, as a result of which they filed a $20 million lawsuit against Caylen, the Toronto Police Department, and Cruise and Tangos. The sheer brutality Caylen displayed and the neglect of investigators and detectives are the 2 main reasons, according to the Richey family, that Tess isn't around anymore. Their incredibly expensive lawsuit is a way of showing Tess respect, honoring her after her unfortunate passing, and a means for the family to heal from this tragic loss. As of right now, there haven't been any updates on whether the Richey family has been successful in suing the parties involved or not, but I sure hope they will be. The case of Tess Richey is all sorts of alarming, devious, and heartbreaking. To think that Tess, who was just out for a good time with a friend, had her life taken from her in such a tragic and brutal way is beyond upsetting, and that too by someone who is a stranger to her. To think that this tragic case took place in one of the safest cities in Canada is just baffling. We can only hope that the Toronto police have learned their lesson and take missing person cases more seriously, because of how Tess's case was handled. It was beyond unprofessional. While Caylen is certainly to blame for such a tragic loss, the police could have at least spared the Richey family the heartache of having to find their daughter themselves. But sadly, that just isn't what happened. A teenage girl leaves home on what should have been an ordinary day, laughing, vibrant, full of plans for the future. Hours later, her silence would echo across an entire community. A car abandoned, a shadowy figure with a haunting tattoo, and a trail of evidence that pointed to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. This is not just the story of a disappearance, it's the unraveling of a nightmare. This is the case of Alexis Murphy. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week. So if you're interested in classic true crime, you've come to the right place. That's pretty much all we do here. So be sure to subscribe. It's completely free and just lets you know when I post new cases. Alexis Tiara Murphy was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, to parents Laura and Troy. Alexis is remembered as a beautiful, joyful, vibrant, and athletic young girl. She attended Nelson County High School, and at the time of the case, she was close to graduation. She was also the high school volleyball team captain, and she planned on continuing the sport once she transitioned to college here pretty soon. Overall, she was a pretty popular kid in high school, and that popularity followed her online as well. Alexis had a huge following on social media. She was a social media queen before it was even a thing. She was always posting videos of herself, updating her followers as well as her friends on what she was doing and where she was going, and she'd always make videos of herself having fun and dancing and singing. She basically documented her entire life online. Alexis's mom, Laura, believes that if she were here today, she would have been TikTok famous, which feels like every teenager's dream these days. But Alexis wasn't snobby about her popularity. She was actually incredibly kind and was the type of person that would strike up a conversation with darn near anybody. But this was actually the problem. See, Alexis was known for being friendly, sometimes to a fault. And some people theorized that her friendliness, it may have been the catalyst for her disappearance. Alexis and her family lived in Shipman, Virginia at the time of the case. And on one particular day in August of 2013, Alexis wanted to go to the salon to get her hair done. See, Alexis was in her senior year of high school and was about to get her pictures taken. So she wanted to look good, so she headed off to the salon to get her hair all gussied up for picture day. It was August 3rd, and Alexis woke up, got dressed, and came barreling down the stairs, and her mom, Laura, remembers this day like it was yesterday. Laura gave Alexis some money for her trip to the salon while she got ready for her shift at the post office. Alexis was happy and laughing, and it just seemed like any other day in the Murphy home. But little did they know, this day would turn tragic really quickly. Alexis hopped into her dad's white Nissan Maxima and made her way to Lynchburg, which is about 20 minutes from her home. Alexis also posted on her Twitter about Lynchburg later that day. But this was the last thing Alexis did before everything went silent. There were no more posts, no more calls or messages. Now, Alexis's family didn't think too much of this at the time. They thought that Alexis was out with friends, having a good time, so they didn't blow up her phone with a bunch of texts. But it wasn't until midnight that Alexis's family started to worry about her. See, Alexis was 17, and she had a midnight curfew. Wherever she was, Alexis had to be home by midnight. And mostly, she was. Alexis wasn't the type to regularly break her curfew and disappoint her parents like that or make them worry. So when Alexis's grandmother went up to check on her after midnight in the early hours of August 4th, she was stunned with fear to see that Alexis's room was empty and her bed had been made up since that morning. It was like she never came back home, and sadly that was the truth. Alexis's grandma immediately called Laura and Troy, and within minutes their minds were going to some worrisome places. They were dreading that Alexis had an accident or she met with some kind of trouble. Now, while this is normally the case if you're a parent, assuming the worst but hoping for the best, something about Alexis's disappearance, it just felt different. So without wasting a single second, Alexis was reported missing. Alexis's family spread the word of her disappearance on social media like a wildfire, and thankfully a lot of people were there to help. They quickly plastered Alexis's name and her disappearance all over social media, and within no time, everyone knew that a teen girl had gone missing. Social media was a great help, and Alexis's family was really grateful for all the help they got from the people who knew and followed Alexis. On the other hand, the detectives were also onto the case instantly, because it didn't make sense. Alexis couldn't have run away from home. She literally just went out to run an errand. There's no indication that Alexis was sad or thinking about running away from it all. It seems like every time a teen goes missing, police want to claim that they just ran away. But that narrative just didn't fit in Alexis's case. She was in her senior year. She was excited about all the fun stuff happening in her life. So where would she have run off to? The investigators had to find the answers to this haunting question. They started by tracing Alexis's footsteps and where she went on August 3rd. Now, we know that Alexis was on her way to Lynchburg, so when the detectives searched the vast area, the search led them to a gas station in Lovingston, Virginia. But why were the police at this gas station? Well, that was because the detectives found out that this gas station surveillance footage caught Alexis on the property on the day she went missing. So the investigators checked the footage, and even though they found nothing out of the ordinary at first, they saw something or someone as Alexis was leaving. Alexis was calm and her usual self. The detectives didn't think that she was being followed by anyone at that point, nor was she uncomfortable with anyone's presence. Alexis was seen walking into the station wearing the same clothes her parents remembered. She filled her car with gas and she went inside sometime later. But as she was coming out, someone held the door open for her. It was a man, but his face wasn't exactly visible since the footage was grainy at best. But there was a distinct and sizable tattoo on the side of the man's neck, and he was wearing a white shirt, so the police had something, even though it wasn't much. But why were the detectives looking at a guy who was doing nothing but holding a door for Alexis? If anything, it's an everyday normal experience. You go out, multiple people hold the door open for you, or you do the same for them. So why were the investigators so hell-bent on this random guy? Well, that's because the mysterious guy also had a vehicle that could only be described as unique. See, the man had a camouflaged suburban Jeep, and it stood out to the police for some odd reason. Police don't typically pursue leads on a hunch. I mean, they're not really allowed to, but something about this guy just seemed off. So while the detectives were investigating other things, like Alexis's phone location, it had now been 3 days since her disappearance, and things weren't looking good. Alexis had been gone for 72 hours. At this point, everyone believed that something bad had happened to her because this was all just so odd. Well, on August 6th, their suspicions were confirmed, and they came across something in a theater parking lot. As police caught wind of a suspicious vehicle in the parking lot, the investigators went out to check it out and found an abandoned white Nissan Maxima. When Alexis's family was called to the scene, they identified it as the same car Alexis was driving the day she went missing. It was Alexis's dad, Troy's car, but there was no sign of his daughter in it. The thing is, Alexis would never just leave the car unattended like that. Well, unless she was in danger and someone had forced her out of the car or something like that. The detectives wanted to know how the car had gotten there, so they decided to check neighboring CCTV cameras. And that was when they came across a nearby mall, and luckily the camera's direction was in the parking lot. When the police viewed the footage close at 10:30 p.m. the day after Alexis went missing, they saw someone driving Alexis's car and getting out of it before making their journey back to wherever they'd come from on foot. The footage was extremely grainy and black and white, and even after enhancing the quality, the driver could not be made out. But even though the detectives couldn't see the face of the driver, one thing was for sure. The person walking out of that car wasn't Alexis. It was a man. Well, at least judging by the silhouette and general physique of the driver, it at least looked like a man. So the investigators knew that this man, or whoever it was the person responsible for Alexis's disappearance. But why would he have her car? Well, if you remember, the detectives were also looking into her phone location, and within days, they got a promising lead. The cell phone was pinging from an area that was approximately a mile away from the gas station where Alexis was last seen. When the police narrowed in on an area, it was an abandoned house surrounded by vegetation. But the detectives spotted something else too. There, in the tall vegetation, a not-so-camouflaged vehicle was parked. It looked eerily similar to the mysterious man's truck at the gas station, the same man who held the door for Alexis on the day she went missing. This was highly suspicious and couldn't just be a coincidence. But did the investigators manage to get their guy? Well, there's only one way to find out. So that abandoned house was not actually abandoned. And it wasn't technically a house, it was more of a camper situation, and someone lived there, but it looked fit to be abandoned in the eyes of many people. When the detectives knocked on the door, a man came out, and what the police noticed right off the bat was the large, dark neck tattoo that he had. It was a Daffy Duck tattoo. When the detectives asked who the man was, he introduced himself as Randy Taylor, and he also confirmed that the vehicle was his. When the investigators asked about Alexis, the man feigned ignorance. He said he didn't know her and hadn't seen her. Still, the detectives had their suspicions, so they wanted to take a look inside the camper. Randy gave the investigators the go-ahead, and right as they stepped foot into the camper, their eyes caught the sight of something suspicious on the floor. It was a diamond stud, and the police thought that it was either an earring or a nose piercing, both of which Alexis had at the time of her disappearance. Moreover, the detectives managed to find what looked like a broken fingernail, as well as a strand of black hair on the carpet flooring, as well as on the pillow on Randy's bed. The investigators took all of these things as evidence, and they sent them for testing. They wanted to see whether these things matched Alexis' DNA or not. In the meantime, the detectives left without arresting Randy because they needed solid proof, but that didn't mean he was off the hook. Randy was a weird guy. He was the type of person you wouldn't want to be alone with at a bus stop or on a quiet street. He just didn't have that vibe to him that screamed safe. It was pretty much the opposite. Anyway, when the DNA results came back, the police's suspicions were cemented. The fingernail and the hair matched Alexis' DNA, so Alexis was in Randy's camper. But why? Well, they didn't know each other. Alexis surely didn't hang out with him in the past. So why was Alexis' DNA all over Randy's camper, and more importantly, what had happened in that camper? Where was Alexis now, and was she even alive? Well, the police didn't want to answer that last question right away, partly because they were dreading where the evidence was pointing. With this revelation, Randy was the main suspect in Alexis' disappearance, and when the investigators confronted him with DNA evidence, that was when Randy's story changed. He suddenly went from not knowing who Alexis was to now remembering her coming to his camper. See, Randy said he was minding his own business in his camper when he heard a knock on the door. When he opened the door, he saw a man with dreadlocks as well as a young 17-year-old looking girl, and the duo wanted illegal substances from him. According to Randy, the pair came inside the camper, sat down, had a few beers, and apparently Alexis left the camper with Mr. Dreadlocks all happy and giggly in his car. Randy stressed that he was just a nice host who opened his camper door to two people, practical strangers. Well, when the detectives asked who the man with the dreadlocks was, Randy said that his name was Damien, and so the investigators went to have a chat with Damien himself. But they soon found out Damien knew nothing about Alexis or meeting Randy on August 3rd because he was in Alabama at the time, which the police were able to confirm. So the detectives knew that they had just been fooled by Randy, and they immediately arrested him on suspicion of abduction. Also, the investigators decided to dig into who Randy actually was, and when investigators asked around, they were surprised, but not really. One look at this guy and you know he probably has a shady past. Well, it turned out Randy loved to creep people out. The employees of the very gas station that Randy visited when Alexis was last seen had a lot to say about Randy. The gas station employees, as well as customers, claimed that Randy would sit in his Jeep for hours in the parking lot and stare people down. He clearly made people uncomfortable. There was never any reason as to why he would spend so much time at that gas station. He just did. Also, the detectives got a very interesting piece of information from another employee. See, this person worked at an adult movie shop, and he claimed that just 45 minutes to an hour before Randy was seen with Alexis on CCTV at that gas station, he was at the shop buying adult movies. So the police knew that it was high time for them to search Randy's camper and turn it upside down for any evidence. And what would you know? They found something, and it led to a discovery that everyone had feared all along. Upon obtaining a search warrant for Randy's camper, the detectives searched every nook and cranny of the place, and under the couch, they found something. It was a white t-shirt, and wrapped in that shirt were black hair extensions as well as fake eyelashes. It was the same white shirt Randy was wearing in the CCTV footage from the gas station. But there was something else the investigators discovered, and it left them horrified. When the detectives turned the shirt around, they were terrified to see a big red stain on it. All the items found were sent for DNA testing, and within no time the results came back, and the DNA on the shirt and the hair extensions matched that of Alexis. Things were getting pretty dark pretty fast, but there was sadly more. The police also recovered a scrapbook, and it was a glimpse into this creepy dude's mind. He had cut out photos of models wearing racy clothing, but the faces were cut out and swapped for a young girl. But it wasn't just a random girl, though. This was clearly the face of someone super young, likely in their teens. And when the detectives dug some more, they found something. The young girl in those pictures was Randy's co-worker's daughter. If you didn't think that this man was disgusting already, then here's your proof. A 48-year-old man had the hots for a young girl who I'm assuming could be a teenager, but even if she isn't, everything about this situation made everyone's skin crawl with disgust. It's just creepy to another level. I mean, where did this dude even find so many pictures of his coworker's daughter? There's so many levels of this that are mind-boggling and largely remain unexplained. The investigators also managed to find Alexis's phone a few feet away from Randy's camper. The evidence against this man is just piling up by the second, and it seems painfully clear what took place here. But did Randy own up to his crimes? Of course not. He was still in jail being held on the abduction charges, and yet he was going on and on about how he didn't know anything about Alexis or who she was. The police, on the other hand, searched high and low for Alexis, but the chances of finding her alive were getting slimmer by the day. And by this point, it was no longer a rescue mission, it was a recovery one. Alexis's family was just so devastated at how quickly things had taken a turn for the worse, and how it all happened so quickly. When you put yourself in the place of these parents, loved ones, whoever it may be, it can really put you in a weird, confused headspace. When you think about it, just a few days ago, Alexis was sitting in the living room with her family, laughing and chatting about who knows what. But now, she's gone? And this guy's to blame? I mean, it physically hurts me to even try to understand this level of dread, confusion, of grief. It's like last Thursday, we were all out getting ice cream. Now this Thursday, we're arranging a funeral. This is basically the scenario that Alexis's family found themselves in. Alexis had gone out to run an errand, something a lot of women and girls do without a second thought, but she never returned, and now the detectives concluded she may not even be alive anymore. It's so hard to imagine being in her family's shoes at that moment, and how quickly their hope just plummeted. But there was one more tragedy in store for the Murphy family, because even after a month of extensive searching, Alexis still wasn't found. And if there was no body, then how could the Murphy family really truly move on? And worse yet, without a body, was Randy even going to be successfully tried for her murder? The investigators were confident they could convict Randy for murder without having recovered Alexis's body. And that's exactly what they did. Randy was charged with Alexis's murder. On September 24th of 2013, more than a month after Alexis's disappearance, Randy was indicted on 2 felony charges. In January of 2014, he was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree felony murder, and abduction with intent to defile, as well as an unrelated grand larceny charge. Randy pleaded not guilty to all of these charges, and he was awaiting trial, which was scheduled for May of that same year. When the trial rolled around, the prosecution presented all the evidence, including Alexis's DNA as well as the CCTV footage, and there was nothing left to argue. On May 8th of 2014, Randy Taylor was found guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to 2 life sentences in July of 2014. He tried to appeal for a lesser sentence by swaying the jury and confusing them that another person was involved in Alexis's murder. But obviously, that didn't work. Randy was successfully convicted, and this man will never be allowed out of prison again. But his games weren't over just yet. Shortly after the trial, Randy thought of a splendid idea to bring himself back into the spotlight. See, in October of 2014, Randy claimed that the investigators had the wrong guy, and the real murderer was still at large. When asked who he was trying to point fingers at, a familiar name popped up: Jesse Matthews. See, unfortunately, at the time of Alexis's disappearance, Virginia was plagued with a lot of other missing person cases. Morgan Harrington, Hannah Graham, and Samantha Clark had just gone missing minutes away from where Alexis was last seen and where her car was found abandoned. Jesse Matthews was a prime suspect in Morgan's as well as Hannah's disappearance. His description matched the man who claimed to be with Alexis on the day that she visited the camper. Jesse was huge, and he also had dreadlocks. This tip by Randy sent the police on a wild goose chase to rule Jesse out, and when they ran DNA and other implicatory tests, Jesse Matthews was eventually ruled out as a suspect in Alexis's case. But it wasn't like Jesse was a good, clean person or anything. If anything, Randy and Jesse were two peas in a pod. Jesse had taken the lives of Morgan and Hannah and was charged with their murders. But seeing Randy throw Jesse under the bus to save himself, well, that's just appalling. The lengths people like this will go to save their own skin is seriously alarming, concerning the lack of regard they have for their own victims. But finally, the whole fiasco with Jesse Matthews was over, and Randy was behind bars, but the Murphy family still wanted to find Alexis and bring her back home. Randy tried to persuade prosecutors to reduce his 2 life sentences to just 20 years in exchange for the location of Alexis's body. But the Murphy family denied this, even though they wanted this closure badly. They wanted Randy to suffer and see the end of his punishment, even if it meant that Alexis couldn't be found. Even though they signed away the possibility of having their daughter's killer reveal her location, though, the Murphy family pressed on. And in the end, they would have to wait another 6 years before they got the news that Alexis was found. On December 3rd of 2020, 6 years after Randy was thrown behind bars for murdering her, human remains were found in Lovington, near the gas station where she was last seen. But it wasn't until February of 2021 that those remains were positively identified as Alexis Murphy. Medical examiners believe that Alexis was smothered, and it's also believed that Randy forced himself on her, which makes the situation all that much worse. It's believed that Randy somehow persuaded Alexis to follow him from the gas station to his camper, where he ended her life. The hair extensions and the broken nails could point towards a struggle, but in the end, Alexis couldn't save herself. He then disposed of her body and her phone nearby and dusted off his hands like nothing even happened. After all was said and done, Alexis's celebration of life was held on June 6th, 2021, on her 25th birthday. It was held in her high school football stadium, and people crowded the expansive space to pay their respects to a happy, hilarious, and wise young girl who lost her life so suddenly and needlessly. The Murphy family has also built a garden for a memorial, which holds Alexis's ashes. At the end of it, her family is hurt, but they're also at peace. Her life was so shamelessly cut short, and for one man's sick pleasure. It is truly disgusting. But somehow they've managed to put their weapons down, admit that what's done is done, and find some level of peace in the aftermath of this mess. It's truly amazing, if I'm being honest, that they were able to find any level of comfort after something so tragic tore their family apart. My heart aches so much for them, but to know that they finally made it to the other side of this, it's just amazing. It's so unbelievable that Alexis was targeted the way that she was. It's not like she was in a particularly dangerous place or anything like that. She was just going to get some gas and go about her day, the same way we all do. It really just goes to show that no matter where you are, no matter who you're with, none of us are ever truly safe. It was a cool October evening in 2015. Zoe Hastings was just 18 years old and had left her home to head to her church to start preparing for a mission trip that she'd be attending the following month. Investigators say she never made it to her church that night. In fact, she didn't make it further than a quarter mile from her home before she became embroiled in a tragic series of events and would never make it back. See, on her way to church, Zoe stopped by a local Walgreens to visit a Redbox movie kiosk. No sooner than she got out of her car to rent a movie, a man sneakily approached her from behind. He made a very simple command: shut your mouth and get in. Zoe Hastings lived alongside her family in Dallas, Texas, and was deeply devoted to her faith, being a very active member of her local church, a branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. When Zoe wasn't at school or hanging out with her friends or family, chances are she could be found doing something for her church. Her dedication was unlike anything most people would imagine, and she made every effort to put her religion before everything else in her life. Outside of her religion and her family, Zoe had just recently graduated from Booker T. Washington High School for the Performing Arts, which is also located in Dallas. But it's never been mentioned what Zoe planned on doing after school was over, outside of the obvious activities that she had planned with her church. She was also a very well-respected swimming instructor at the White Rock YMCA, so it's pretty clear Zoe had her hands in a lot of different things. She was a genuinely talented young woman with so much promise. Zoe's father, Jim, was actually a bishop for the family's church, and he helped out with the church's finances, but he also taught some of the services there as well. He even spent one night per week helping members of the church with any issues they may have been dealing with, be it family problems, spiritual issues, or otherwise. He was a great example for Zoe, so it's easy to see how she became so deeply involved in her faith. Zoe's mother, on the other hand, was also a shining example and an amazing woman. Cheryl Hastings, more than anything else, loved being a mother, so much so that she actually put her entire career on hold when the family welcomed their third child into the world. After things settled down a little bit, Cheryl eventually decided to go back to work after finishing her education to become a nurse. She was actually attending schooling to get her master's degree when this case unfolded. The Hastings were all part of a relatively large family, with Zoe being one of 5 children. Considering Zoe was the oldest, it's safe to say that her siblings most likely looked up to her quite a bit, and Zoe seems to have taken pride in being a great example for them. Cheryl's mother actually recalled one particular moment that is a perfect example of the type of person that Zoe was, saying that on the Friday before she vanished, Zoe wrote a note to their mailman and put it in their mailbox, asking what his favorite drink was, what his favorite candy bar was, and several other things to get to know him better. She wasn't just doing this to be nice and show interest, she actually planned to go out and buy the man some of his favorite things so that she could show her appreciation for his hard work. But unfortunately, that mailman would never get to know the true extent of Zoe's kindness. That's because before she could show it, Zoe vanished. It was Sunday, October 11th, 2015. Zoe was heading to a meeting at her church where she would be discussing an upcoming mission trip that she'd been looking forward to for weeks. She left her home at about 4:40 p.m. and planned on stopping by a local Walgreens on her way to church. This Walgreens was actually within view of her home, less than a quarter mile away, and you could see the big Walgreens sign from the front lawn. Court records show that Zoe made it to the Walgreens by about 4:42 p.m. that evening, where she approached the red box kiosk located just outside the front door of the building. Now, for those of you that may not be located in the United States, or maybe you've just never seen a red box kiosk, it's basically a movie rental kiosk where you just walk up, touch a screen to select a movie you want to rent, and then out pops the DVD or Blu-ray of that movie. When you're done, you just bring the movie back and pay a daily fee for however long you had the movie. On this particular night, Zoe stopped by the Walgreens to return a movie that she'd previously rented. She drove up near the kiosk in her family's minivan and hopped out of the car. She wasn't outside of the car for more than a few seconds when a witness spotted a strange-looking man approaching Zoe's vehicle. This witness worked at a tattoo parlor that was located in the same intersection as the Walgreens. He said that as he looked across the street, he noticed Zoe getting out of her van, returning the movie, and then turning back to get into her van. No sooner than she arrived at the driver's side of the van, a short, heavy-set man rapidly approached the door, grabbing it and preventing Zoe from closing it. The witness says that he couldn't make out what the two were saying, but he mentioned that the man was overly animated and said their conversation lasted no more than 5 seconds before Zoe scooted over into the passenger seat, allowing the man to drive the van. The witness says that at this point, he believed the two must have known each other, considering how little resistance Zoe put up against him. He also added that he saw this same man later on that day around dusk. But a separate witness report tells a slightly different story. This report comes from a homeless man who was sitting across the street from the Walgreens when the scene unfolded. He says that the heavy-set man approached Zoe rapidly and aggressively while doing his best to sneak up on her from behind. The homeless man mentioned that the suspect was walking incredibly strangely, but was trying not to gather too much attention. He says that as soon as the man approached the side of the car, it was clear Zoe was uncomfortable. He said the man put his arms around the doorway of the vehicle so Zoe couldn't get away, all the while reaching into his pocket for something. The witness says he immediately noticed this encounter was not friendly, so he did his best to try to run across the street to confront them, but there was so much traffic that he couldn't make it across in time. By the time he got there, the man had already sped away with Zoe in the passenger seat, so he did the only thing he knew to do, and he ran to the closest convenience store to call 911. But interestingly, police say that they have no record of this 911 call taking place, so it's entirely possible the man made this part of the story up. When digging a bit deeper into this witness's history, he also had a warrant out for his arrest, so I would tend to say this 911 call probably never happened. But either way, the remainder of his statement does appear to be true, as we'll see in just a moment. On the evening that Zoe vanished, she was expected to be at her church for the aforementioned mission trip prep class at about 5 p.m. Unfortunately, she never made it to the church that evening. She was expected to return home around 6:30 p.m. for family dinner. She never made it home either. When Zoe missed out on dinner, her parents began calling and texting her phone over and over again, but she never picked up. When all else failed, her family resorted to calling several of her friends and church members, but friends hadn't seen her, and church members said she never showed up for the prep class that evening. It would be around 10 p.m. when Zoe's parents had finally had enough, and that's when they decided to call in the help of the local police and officially report Zoe Hastings as missing. After Zoe's parents reported her missing, it didn't take long before one of her family members found out that they could use the Find My iPhone app on their phone to track down Zoe's last known location. This would take place early the following morning on October 12th. Now, I'm not sure how they managed to do this without Zoe's password, but it didn't take them long to pull up the info and, rather strangely, find out that Zoe was just 5 minutes away from home. Without hesitation, the family loaded into the car and headed off in the direction of Zoe's phone. But that's when they were met with a sight they wished they could erase from their memory. As the family drew closer to the location that had been pinned on the map, they noticed flashing lights just in the distance. As they pulled up to the area, they realized these lights were encompassing the exact spot where Zoe's phone had last pinged. When Zoe's family pulled over and exited the car, they were approached by several police officers who shared news that no parent wants to hear. Unfortunately, by the time first responders made it to the scene, there was nothing they could do. Zoe had lost her life. But what happened? To her parents, this whole situation, it just seemed so sudden, so completely out of left field. Well, according to detectives, earlier that morning, a man named Kurt was out walking his dog when he noticed another man running in his direction, frantically trying to get his attention. As the man approached, it was obvious that he was upset and visibly shaken. He called out to Kurt and shouted something along the lines of, "There's a car and a girl down in this creek," pointing to a large ditch or a culvert area that was nearby. The unidentified man then led Kurt over to where the car was located, nearby Easton Road and Lippett Avenue. When the two arrived, there was incredibly dense brush that filled the area, but a white van could clearly be seen from the roadside, poking out from the brush. The unidentified man then descended down the steep embankment to check out the van. When he approached, he found Zoe nearby, completely unresponsive. The man then made his way back to the street, informed Kurt of what was going on, then ran away before police could arrive, leaving Kurt to call 911 on his own. Police arrived at the scene of the crime in record time, but unfortunately, there was just nothing they could do. They found Zoe lying face down about 20 feet from the driver's side door of her minivan. The van had been driven down the embankment and crashed into the bottom of the creek, meaning the van was merely vertical when police found it. When detectives began collecting evidence and photos from the scene of the crime, it was very clear what had taken place here. Zoe had been abducted, taken advantage of, and then dumped here with no regard. As investigators combed through the thick foliage, they managed to find a knife covered in red stains that had been tossed near the top of the embankment. Before long, detectives also found Zoe's phone. And when looking at location data, they found that she'd arrived at this creek at exactly 5:01 p.m. the night before, meaning she'd likely lost her life just 15 minutes after leaving her home that night. Police made a comment about the state of the crime scene, stating that Zoe had been subjected to what they called, quote, obvious homicidal violence, but they refused to describe much else other than this. Thankfully, Zoe's family were prevented from getting too close to the crime scene, with one police officer stepping in and telling the family they weren't allowed to get any closer because they'd not be able to forget what they saw that day. Zoe's parents have said that since that moment, they've made every effort to never see a single photo from the scene of the crime from that awful evening, choosing to remember their daughter for who she was rather than what she eventually became at the hands of some cruel, heartless monster. After police spent several hours scouring every square inch of the crime scene, they were left with a considerable amount of evidence stored away. Typically, in cases like this, it can take detectives and forensic experts quite a long time to come up with a list of suspects. But thankfully, in this case, that wasn't true. In fact, the person who did this to Zoe left behind every last shred of evidence that prosecutors would need to find him. Not only was this guy a cold-blooded waste of breath, but the man was also a world-class idiot. It's like he left a roadmap for investigators to follow in a typical X marks the spot fashion. When police looked over the evidence they'd collected from the scene of the crime, they realized they'd collected several hairs left behind by the assailant, as well as copious amounts of DNA that were found both on Zoe's body and the knife that had been found near the top of the embankment. Not only this, but they didn't even have to try hard to track down who the DNA belonged to. The man's DNA was already entered into the police database multiple times in the past. By October 24th, 2015, about 2 weeks after the crime unfolded, police announced they'd found their man, Antonio Cochran. Antonio Cochran was quickly identified as the man who witnesses had spotted stalking Zoe in the Walgreens parking lot that fateful evening. His DNA was littered across the entire crime scene, and his DNA was in the police database from various accusations and crimes that he'd committed over the years. When police reviewed his record, they noticed that his crimes were all incredibly violent, and most of them were boiled down to sexual urges. When police spoke with those who knew Antonio growing up, nearly everyone who knew him had nothing good to say about him. He had a handful of people in his life who cared about him, but for the most part, he disgusted nearly everyone he met. Some of his former classmates from high school spoke about how he'd always look at female classmates as though they were a freshly cut piece of steak. He had no regard for them as people. He saw them as nothing more than objects for his own pleasure, making awful faces and gestures at them every chance he got. Just a nasty person. To top this off, Antonio was 37 years old when he was picked up by police, and his record indicated that he'd been accused of having a sexual relationship with his ex-girlfriend's 17-year-old daughter just a few years prior. Though admittedly, these allegations never led to a conviction, though there were numerous first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have known about this relationship, insinuating it had been taking place for at least a few months. But again, these are purely allegations, and Antonio was never convicted for this. Even though police had more than enough evidence to convict Antonio in Zoe's case, they decided to continue digging into his past to try to piece together why he would have done such a thing. This is when they managed to get a hold of his cell phone history. On the day that he claimed Zoe's life and tossed her out like an empty soda can, Antonio had been frantically texting several of his friends. Now, I've got to admit, many of these texts that he sent don't seem to make any sense whatsoever. I'm not sure if this is because he was abbreviating every word to the point that it was simply unreadable, or if this is because he was in such a frazzled state of mind that he couldn't concoct a coherent thought. I really just don't know. But from what I can make out from his texts, Antonio had first texted his roommate and claimed he was going to be moving out. This appears to have been completely unexpected, and he was basically leaving his roommate high and dry. But there does appear to be more to this story than the texts lead on, because he signed off this announcement by saying, "This will be the last you ever hear from me," suggesting there was definitely some bad blood between the two. He then texted an ex-girlfriend and said that a woman named Reina, who'd supposedly been like a mother to Antonio, had passed away unexpectedly, quote, "right in front of me." He then continued texting various people, telling someone known as Mimi that he'd been drinking, driving, and sobbing for hours after hearing the news about Reina, with this text coming through just about an hour before his encounter with Zoe. It's very clear to see that when Antonio abducted Zoe, he was in a very difficult state of mind. The next text Antonio sent would be to someone known as Selena, with him simply saying, "My life is over, you'll find out soon enough." This text was sent about 4 hours after the crimes against Zoe were carried out. Interestingly, the internet history from Antonio's phone showed that he'd made more than 1,100 search requests, but police haven't been clear if all these search requests were done the same day of the crime or if these were spread out over a certain period of time. But either way, at least 32 of these searches were Antonio checking the local news to see if Zoe's body had been located, as well as checking in to see what police suspected could have happened to her. This information made it painfully clear Antonio was terrified. But where does all this leave us? Well, if the text messages sent from Antonio's phone are to be believed, it sounds like he was most likely incredibly intoxicated at the time that he abducted Zoe. And this probably explained why he was so overly animated in his actions, and probably explains the weird way that he was walking, as described by the 2 eyewitnesses. But still, why did he target Zoe of all people? She never said a word to him, never even looked in his direction. So why grab this innocent girl just because you're drunk and clearly distressed because someone close to you passed away? Truthfully, we don't know. But if you ask me, I don't think it's too much of a long shot to assume it was purely a crime of opportunity. After all, Antonio has an incredibly colorful history with women, particularly involving violent or sexual encounters with women. Even his close friends admitted to this. Honestly, I think this crime was just an example of the kind of person Antonio is. There was no motive, there was no reasoning. He did it because he could, because he wanted to. In court, one of his close friends asked the jury to be lenient on him, saying that he was nothing more than a victim of a bad upbringing. But the jury wasn't going to hear it. Needless to say, when Antonio was sent to trial, he was quickly found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison, having to serve a minimum of 30 years before he'll have any chance at parole. But realistically, I don't see a man this violent and with this dark of a history ever seeing the light of day again. When speaking about the trial, the terrible, cruel treatment his daughter was subjected to, and the future, Zoe's father explained how he and his remaining family members are doing their best to make something good from a bad situation. He admitted that one of the hardest parts of this is trying to teach their remaining children that they are still safe, even though their oldest sister was abducted within eyesight of their home. He says that it's shaken the very foundations of their family, and he and Cheryl just don't know how to make their children feel comfortable again. After Zoe lost her life, Jim dedicated himself even more to the church that he was already doing so much to serve. But he realized that he couldn't help others if he couldn't first help himself. This is when he decided to take time out of every day to deal with his emotions by sketching his family members, a different family member each day. He's created more than 900 drawings of his family members, which he shares on his Instagram account, detailing the incredible range of emotion that he's experienced over these last few years, as well as the freedom that comes from getting these emotions out of his own mind and into the real world. Jim says that he continues to do this every single day, even after all this time. He even used this drawing method to cope with the loss of his mother, who passed away from cancer, drawing a sketch of her every day for the final 6 weeks of her life. Jim says that drawing has helped him to realize just how much he has left to live for, and it's inspired him to make sure he uses his time productively rather than only focusing on the negative. Cheryl, Zoe's mother, has also taken great strides to turn this tragedy into something positive. Cheryl has been a nurse for several years, but around the time that Zoe lost her life, she noticed an advertisement that was recruiting nurses to become specialists who focus on women who'd been assaulted. At first, Cheryl thought this was a terrible idea, but the more she let it sink in, she says that a voice in her head kept urging her to join the program. So she did. No one knows the pain of something like this better than someone who's been affected by it directly, and Cheryl definitely fit that bill. You've got to admit, becoming a nurse for a program such as this, it's not a job anybody wants to do. But the brave, noble, and honorable women who do take on this role, well, they're a breed of their own. Cheryl is very grateful to be able to be part of such a sensitive program, helping these women to cope from the immeasurable pain that they've been put through, and in some small way, make a positive difference in the lives of those who need it more than anyone else. Out of every 10 domestic violence situations, 8 of the victims are women, and 9 of the perpetrators are men. These are the stats from Costa Rica. In 2019 alone, 11 women lost their lives to domestic violence in Costa Rica, and one of them was a 19-year-old single mother, Eva Ulloa. Eva was an activist who had a very stern voice on social media regarding gender-based violence. But what happens when a woman becomes a victim of the very thing she's raising her voice against? Tragically, that's exactly what happened to Eva on the fateful day of November 1st, 2019. Even though the Costa Rican police acted quickly in Eva's case, and the perpetrator was caught immediately, there were countless signs and pleas for help leading up to the crime. Eva's life could have been saved many times over, but unfortunately, that didn't happen. Eva Ulloa was born in the year 2000 in Costa Rica, and this is also the place where the rest of this tragic case takes place. Not much is known about her childhood, but according to her parents and friends, Eva was defined as a sweet and caring girl. She was also very trusting, and her parents defined her as being a bit naive, but with a heart of gold. Like anyone, Eva interacted with a lot of people on social media, and Facebook was her go-to place for expressing her thoughts with her followers. Eva was a huge advocate for women's rights, and she was a feminist through and through. She raised her voice against a lot of issues surrounding gender-based violence. Facebook was an outlet and a platform for Eva to express her thoughts on the many unfortunate occurrences relating to violence against women that took place mainly in Costa Rica. At the time of the crime in 2019, Eva was studying social work at the Latin University of Costa Rica, while being active on Facebook about her views on gender-based violence and seeking new ways to stop them once and for all. Eva, being the helpful and generous person that she was, also encouraged women to seek help if they ever found themselves in an unfortunate situation, to the point where she even extended her own help to women she knew or people in her friend circle. Eva was doing her part in trying to raise awareness against violence of all kinds, but particularly against women. But as Eva was fighting for women's rights, she was also dealing with something eerily similar to what she was preaching on social media in her personal life. What was even more heartbreaking was the fact that she'd been fighting this battle for years, during which many awful things happened to her. It all started when Eva was just 13 years old. Being naive and a hopeless romantic, Eva had little experience in relationships, and she tended to fall hard and fast for the people that she was interested in. And that's exactly what happened when teenage Eva had her very first and probably longest lasting experience in love and relationships, with a man named Randall Oviedo. Randall Oviedo lived super close to Eva. Their houses were about 5 blocks away and they saw each other all the time. When Eva was only 13, Randall was 20. He was legally an adult, which is very alarming, but the two quickly got into a relationship regardless. There were countless red flags surrounding Randall, but it seems that Eva was completely unaware of most of them. For starters, Randall was heavily involved in drug dealing and a trafficking gang in San Pablo, a nearby district of Costa Rica. This operation was mainly led by his brother and other people that he knew closely. Randall's job was to supply the product to buyers. And it's shocking to think that a young 20-year-old man would be the main supplier of such a dangerous and shady business, but it seemed that Randall loved his work. Eva knew that Randall wasn't the most morally ethical person. This relationship had no future, and anyone from the outside could see it, but Eva wanted to make it work because she truly loved and cared about Randall. This makes everything about the case all the more sad and tragic. Understandably, given Randall's background and relatively big age gap, Eva's parents did not approve of their daughter's relationship. They tried very hard to reason with Eva that Randall was a bad influence on her, and they tried to persuade Eva to end her relationship with Randall. But Eva was already under Randall's spell, and she was so enamored by him that she didn't want to see reason or logic. This led to something very unexpected. Soon after Eva and Randall started dating, Eva found out that she was pregnant. She was just 15 years old by this time. Now, this was alarming on so many levels. No matter whether Eva consented to their physical relationship or not, Randall was an adult, and he should have been making reasonable choices, but he didn't. This man had an extensive track record of bad decisions, and it doesn't seem like his involvement with Eva was going to be any different. Randall was known for being a reckless, dangerous, and non-serious man who had only one goal: to manipulate Eva into submission. It's distressing to consider what Randall put Eva through. On many occasions, Randall emotionally, physically, and psychologically abused Eva and drove Eva into a corner of despair, where she couldn't do anything but feel helpless. Eva thought that there was no light at the end of the tunnel. She felt truly trapped by this man. She was slowly beginning to see that Randall was no good for her. But how could she leave? He was so volatile and so dangerous that even if she announced she wanted to end the relationship, he most likely would not be letting her go easily. But something happened that gave Eva another chance at life. See, Randall, with his involvement in such a vile business, so to call it, soon caught the attention of the Costa Rican authorities. Although the gang Randall operated wasn't huge by any means, it was still an illegal business, which meant that Randall and the rest of the members were going to face consequences if they got caught. Well, luckily, that happened, and Randall and his gang members, including his brother and 3 closest friends, were arrested in early 2016 for drug trafficking. And this was the same time that Eva was due to give birth. This was very hard for Eva as a young, new mother-to-be. But she was determined to bring light into her very dark world, and in mid-2016, while Randall was in jail for drug trafficking for 6 years, Eva gave birth to a beautiful and healthy baby boy. Now, you would think that a baby would change Randall's perspective, and he would try to turn his life around for the sake of his family. But that wasn't the case. Randall actually called Eva immediately after she delivered their baby, but not to wish her well and ask about their son. It was to wish Eva and the baby the worst. Randall was furious over the phone and was lashing out at Eva, terrifying her to no end. Eva, at that point in time, started to become detached from Randall. She was focused on her pregnancy, her baby's birth, and her new life with her son. And this was also the time when Eva finally and fortunately realized that Randall was no good for her, especially after the grueling phone call she received in the hospital. See, there were signs of abuse in the relationship from the get-go, but Eva, being in love and seeing the world with rose-tinted glasses, wasn't ready to accept reality. Randall had tried to isolate Eva from her friends and family, and even resorted to physically abusing Eva whenever she tried to stand up for herself. He was manipulative to the point where Eva wasn't even allowed to see her parents, who she missed desperately. Fortunately, when Randall was arrested and sent to prison, this was a time for Eva to regroup and reclaim control of her life. But Randall, being the manipulator he was, tried to control Eva even behind bars. Randall would constantly call Eva from prison, trying to persuade her to get back together with him. But Eva held her ground. She focused all of her time on her baby and her studies, and even broke up with Randall to start a new relationship. But things were anything but perfect. See, Randall had no idea about Eva being in a new relationship, and she'd moved on with her life. He got wind of this from one of his brothers, who wasn't in prison, claiming that he saw Eva with another man. This information infuriated Randall because he realized he no longer had control over her. Now, not only had he lost his girlfriend at this point, but his son as well. Now, you would think that Ava's new relationship was better than her previous one, but that wasn't the case. Her current partner also mistreated and abused her, which led Ava to seek help from the National Institute for Women. This is essentially a platform for women to seek professional help and report their abuse, and hopefully be given a hand to help them out of the bad situation that they found themselves in. Ava got professional help and even legal advice as to how to protect herself from violence coming from someone who she was in a relationship with. Unfortunately, Ava found herself in a position that many men and women find themselves in time and time again. You'd think that if you fell for the wrong person once, you'd make dang sure not to do that a second time. But this sort of behavior often becomes a pattern, an endless cycle. It leads so many people down the wrong path because they feel like they keep falling for the same type of person again and again. And let's be honest, that's exactly what's happening. But it's not the victim's fault. This type of thinking, this type of attraction, for lack of a better word, becomes so easy to get trapped in that it feels like it attaches itself to your DNA. It becomes a part of who you are. So much so that you can't even begin to fathom how to change this pattern of thinking. This is why so many people begin to blame themselves, but that never ends well, and that's such a disturbing way of looking at the situation. Thankfully, Ava knew that there was a way out, and kudos to her for seeing the danger of the path before her and finding professional help before it was too late. This was the point in her life where Eva decided to advocate for women's rights, and she did so by expressing her very moving thoughts on Facebook. She also took part in many of these awareness movements and campaigns, and in one of them she was seen with her son, holding a sign that read, "In my family, there's no room for hate." Eva, now feeling more empowered than ever, went to the family court of Costa Rica and got a protective order against her ex-partner, Randall. But a simple sheet of paper would be no help, because evil was closing in on Eva fast, and she was about to experience the most horrific thing someone could ever witness in their life. Remember that Randall was supposed to serve 6 years behind bars for his drug-related charges? Well, oddly enough, he was released within 3 years on good behavior. As you may have guessed, Randall constantly followed Eva around as soon as he got out of prison, persuading her to get back together with him and trying to force her to let him see his son, the same son who he wished the worst for on the day of his birth. If that doesn't make your blood boil, then I don't know what will. Eva, even though she had no plans on getting back together with Randall, wanted their child to have a somewhat stable family unit. So Eva, trying to do what was right, made regular visits to Randall's house to try to normalize things as best she could, without getting Randall's hopes up, that is. Eva had made it clear time and time again that the reason for their meetings was only for Randall to see his son and nothing else. But Randall wasn't backing up. He constantly tried to get Eva back, which was why she was forced to take out an order of protective measures against him. Fast forward to November 1st, 2019. It was just another normal day for Eva, and she got herself and son dressed to go meet Randall at his house. At that time, Randall's parents were also present in the house, although they were on the upper level, and Eva and Randall were downstairs. Also, it's important to note that there was another child present in the house at the time. It was a 5-year-old daughter who was Randall's child from a previous relationship. Keep this detail in mind because we'll get back to that in just a minute. As we discussed, Eva had gotten into the habit of letting Randall meet his son over the past couple of months. And on November 1st, Eva and her baby boy, who was now 3 years old, went to Randall's house to meet him and let him spend time with their son. But Randall had other very malicious intentions on that day. Shortly after Eva arrived, Randall continued to bother her, saying that they should get back together. Now, Eva was understandably sick and tired of hearing these empty words from Randall. She knew that Randall only wanted to control her, and their getting back together only meant that Randall had something to exercise control on. The constant persuasion from Randall angered Eva, and unsurprisingly, a verbal argument ensued. It was very heated, and that is never a good sign. Now, it's unclear what led to the sudden escalation of the situation, as the only people who can tell what really happened are Eva and Randall. But things got really bad really fast. At some point during their argument, Randall pulled out a weapon, pointed it at Eva, who had her back to him and was completely clueless, and fired twice. While this attack on Eva was bad enough, we can't forget there were children in this room. Both Ava's son and Randall's daughter from the previous marriage. They both witnessed the crime firsthand. Considering these kids were the ages of 3 and 5, it stands to reason that they'll both likely remember this moment for the rest of their lives. And the fact that this horrific act was carried out by their father, no less, is beyond words. As Eva was lying on the floor fighting for her life with 2 fatal shots to the head, luckily Randall's parents, who had heard the commotion and the deafening gunshots, immediately called the police. Neighbors also heard the shots, and they also called the police. And with a stroke of luck, the police arrived within minutes at the scene, and the parents wasted no time in throwing their son Randall under the bus. They knew that Randall was manipulative, abusive, and very violent, and he wasn't above committing such a heinous act to get the upper hand. The police immediately arrested Randall, who was trying to make a run for it, while emergency services rushed to Ava's side. Eva had a very weak pulse, and it was a race against time to get her to a hospital. She was immediately loaded into an ambulance and taken to the nearby hospital. But upon arrival, sadly, 19-year-old Eva had succumbed to her injuries and passed away. The whole situation was just too much. After Ava's tragic and sudden passing, the police had to execute another gut-wrenching task, and that was to inform Ava's family. Ava's parents were at home just 5 blocks away from where Eva was tragically attacked, and when they received the call from the police, Ava's mother, Alina, remembers this scene so vividly. She felt that time had stopped when she heard Ava's name from the police. She was immediately called to the scene, Police cars and crime scene tapes surrounded the house, and it was a horrible situation. When a police officer inquired Alina about what Eva was wearing when she left the house, Alina was stunned into silence. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, so she answered and confirmed her daughter's attire. And it was at that moment that the police broke the worst news any mother could hear. The police told Alina that Eva had been attacked by her ex-partner, saying, quote, "Ma'am, I wish I could tell you that it's not your daughter, but it is." Eva's parents had their entire world shattered in just one single night. Randall's parents were of great help because they helped the police in locating the weapon used on Eva, which was unsurprisingly illegally owned by Randall. It was found wedged in a brick wall behind the house, and it was immediately taken as evidence by the police. After his arrest, it would soon come to light that Randall, aside from operating a drug ring, had a very turbulent past and was also involved in crimes like simple and aggravated robbery, dating back several years before his arrests for the trafficking ring. It just goes to show that Randall was a danger to society from the very beginning, and he was a seasoned criminal. Remember, some of these crimes took place when he was just a teenager. This man was the living embodiment of evil through and through, but thankfully, his reign of terror was nearly over. Eva's funeral was held on November 3rd, 2019, which was a Sunday. Eva was laid to rest by her mourning parents, friends, and other people who admired her spirit and vision. Eva's passing was becoming national news, and people were stunned and saddened by her tragic passing. The president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado, came forth with a statement on Eva's tragic demise, and he said, quote, "I'm deeply saddened by the murder of Eva and all the other women who've been victims of violence." For some background, Costa Rica has been plagued with a lot of incidents that involve violence and subsequent murders of women, all rooted in a problem that affects their society as a whole: gender-based violence. After Eva's devastating passing, the custody of her son was granted to Eva's parents, who were treating him with all the love and attention that Eva would have wanted to shower him with in her own life. Tragically, this young man will have to live without his mother and father, and with the memory of his father aiming the weapon at his own unsuspecting mother, which is just so frightening and devastating for a child to witness. I cannot imagine the trials that this poor young man is going to go through. This type of trauma, there's no cure for. There's no amount of therapy that'll take away what this little boy witnessed that evening. In July of 2021, 2 years after Randall had attacked and taken Eva's life, the trial began. This was a trial that everyone was looking forward to because it was the only way by which justice would be served to Eva, and the only way her family would finally be able to find peace. The prosecution presented evidence of abuse in Eva and Randall's relationship, along with witness testimonies, and they stressed on the fact that Randall was violent towards Eva, and he had every intention of ending her life on the day of the crime. Randall's defense claimed that Randall acted in a fit of jealous rage on the day of the crime, when he saw that Eva received an intimate video call from another man, which is such a joke of a defense claim. It makes me wonder if this defense team even believed in the case from the beginning, or if they were just pulling the stuff out of thin air to ensure that this man went to prison. In the end, the jury deliberated and Randall was found guilty. He was given the maximum sentence, which was 35 years in prison. Unfortunately, that means this man will very likely be released one day and still have a good chunk of his life ahead of him. Meanwhile, Eva's family is left with a wound that will never heal. They couldn't have ever imagined that their daughter would be taken away from them so soon in such a vicious way. Eva was someone who fought for women's rights and gender-based aggression, but she got trapped in the same web and sadly couldn't make it out alive, even though she took all the protective measures. The Costa Rican government has stated that eradication of violence against women is a national and top priority, but these are just words until they're acted upon. Time will tell if they're actually willing to make a change. The tragedy that Eva went through on November 1st of 2019 could have been prevented, if only the perpetrator hadn't been released from prison so early on charges that were so severe. And if only Eva's pleas for help were taken seriously, she could still be here today, alive and well, trying to make the world a better place. It's easier said than done to leave an abusive relationship or to stop being on the receiving end of aggression, but there is always a way out. No one is worth getting humiliated or violated just because of gender. And if we constantly preach that the world has to be a better place, then we need to align our actions and visions with the results that we want to see, regardless of gender, race, or ethnicity. I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. That's why true crime stories has such a focus on female cases, because in countries like this, 8 out of 10 domestic violence cases involve women as victims. That's not just a slight majority, that's 80%. We need to bring more awareness to these cases, and we need to start taking action. And for the people like you and me with no political authority to change the laws, that can mean things as simple as keeping an extra close eye out for the women that you care about, and the men for that matter. Don't blow off claims of people feeling targeted, preyed upon, or made to feel uncomfortable. I know people who have personally been victimized by stalking, unwanted advances, and worse. These are not claims that I personally take lightly, but these perpetrators were dealt with quickly and immediately, and they are no longer a problem now. This is the type of urgency that everyone needs to have with cases like this. This world needs to be a safer place for everyone, and no one should have to live with the constant fear of sexual or relational harassment. No one. Stephanie Scott was a well-known and very well-respected high school teacher from New South Wales, Australia. Investigators say that Stephanie had been at school on Easter Sunday of 2015, getting prepared for some upcoming classes. Detectives say that as soon as she began to leave later that afternoon, she was ambushed from behind, being forced into a storage closet where a grisly, callous, and disturbing crime unfolded. This isn't the worst part, though. As police would soon learn, this crime would hit much closer to home than anyone could have expected. That's because, as the evidence would soon reveal, Stephanie knew the person behind the crime, and she knew them well. The story of this crime is heartbreaking, stomach-churning, and easily one of the most cold and heartless crimes I've ever covered here on True Crime Stories. So strap in, because this is going to be a wild one. Before we get too far into the case, I just want to remind you that pretty much all of these cases come from suggestions that you guys provide. So if there are any other cases you'd like to see me cover in the future, just let me know in the comments or in an email. I may not be able to cover every case, but I'll certainly look into every suggestion that you guys provide. Stephanie Scott was born on October 14th, 1988 in Sydney, Australia. The daughter of Robert and Marilyn Scott, Stephanie was just 26 years old in 2015 when this case took place. Stephanie's father was a principal at a nearby high school for much of her childhood, meaning Stephanie was well educated about the ins and outs of the public school system. With this in mind, it's no surprise that she herself decided to join in and become a school teacher after college. Stephanie had been teaching at Leeton High School in Leeton, New South Wales. Leeton, when compared to similar cities here in the States, is a very small community with a population of just around 7,400 people. It's pretty far off the beaten path, over 80 miles from the nearest city. When doing research into this case, I found several local residents who insist that the town is a wonderful place to be. But I also found a couple remarks about crimes in the area that are pretty concerning, with one person claiming that substance abuse is a pretty big issue in Leeton. This person claims that it's become such a problem that you'll see people on the streets of Leeton dealing in broad daylight or dealing over the counter at their local grocery stores, seemingly without a care in the world regarding who may see them or report them. Now, I obviously can't confirm these rumors, but it definitely makes you question just how great of a town Leeton really is. Overall, though, most people claim that the town is the perfect place to raise a small family, as Leeton is known for being a fairly quiet, clean, and affordable place to live. For Stephanie Scott, things couldn't have been better for her in Leeton. She had a wonderful job that paid well enough, as well as a loving fiance that she was fiercely dedicated to. In fact, Stephanie and her fiance, Aaron Leeson Woolley, were scheduled to be married just after Easter of 2015. The two were high school sweethearts, meaning they must have been dating for close to 10 years by this point, becoming engaged about a year earlier in 2014. Their wedding date was scheduled for April 11th, 2015, but an unexpected and tragic change of plans would force Aaron to cancel their wedding and leave the Scott and Leeson Woolley families begging for answers. It was April 3rd, 2015. Stephanie and Aaron kissed each other goodbye at around 12:30 p.m., not knowing that this would be their last time to ever see each other. The couple had been invited to attend a party later that afternoon, but Stephanie had much bigger plans on her mind. With Stephanie and Aaron being scheduled to get married on the 11th, Stephanie had requested a few weeks off of school so that the two could go on a honeymoon together. The school faculty were more than happy to allow this, so they hired a substitute teacher to take Stephanie's place while the two were gone. I couldn't find any specific mention of how long the couple planned on being gone, but it seems like most sources suggest that it may have been about 2 or 3 weeks. With this in mind, Stephanie was still expected to put together a curriculum for her students, though these lessons would be taught by the substitute teacher. This meant that Stephanie had a lot of work to do if she wanted to leave her students with enough work for the upcoming weeks, while also providing herself enough time to plan and get ready for their upcoming wedding. So Stephanie told her fiance that she would unfortunately have to miss the party that they'd been planning on going to, but she assured Aaron that she still wanted him to go. Stephanie instead would be heading to Leeton High School so that she could work on finalizing some of the lesson plans for her students before turning the info over to the substitute teacher. The couple kept in contact with each other for the remainder of that afternoon, texting each other every so often and even calling and speaking on the phone at about 10:30 p.m. that night. The following morning, Stephanie headed back to the school to make final arrangements, informing her fiancé of her plans via text message, letting him know when she was leaving the house. Aaron got dressed, said his goodbyes to his wife through the phone, and charged up his phone so that he could call Stephanie when he was heading back to the town of Leeton. They had spoken the night before about heading out to one of their favorite restaurants that evening when Aaron returned, and Stephanie was on board with this. But strangely enough, when Aaron tried to call Stephanie later that day, his call went to voicemail. He tried multiple times after this, but each and every time, Stephanie refused to answer. Aaron convinced himself that Stephanie must have just been distracted by work or stepped out of the classroom, and he didn't think much of it. But when he arrived back home later that evening, he noticed that her car was missing, and there was no sign of his soon-to-be wife anywhere. This was incredibly unusual, as Stephanie was known for being a very punctual and organized person. Aaron was incredibly confused, and he began to wonder if Stephanie may have been spending time at a friend's house. He got back into his car and began to drive around town, trying to find any signs of Stephanie, all the while admitting to himself that this was a bit ridiculous, knowing there was virtually no chance of finding her without any clues to go on. He didn't feel like circling the town would prove anything, but he gave it a shot regardless. He felt that he had to do something because this was so unusual for someone like Stephanie. His search of the town naturally didn't yield any results. By this point, he was getting pretty anxious. He began calling all of Stephanie's friends, but when none of them had heard from her either, he knew something was terribly wrong. With nowhere else to turn, Aaron canceled the couple's dinner plans for the evening and eventually had to go to bed, though he admits that he didn't sleep for even a single moment that entire night. By the time morning broke and Aaron still had not heard from Stephanie, he knew that it was time to contact her family. Her family had also not heard from Stephanie in quite some time, so together they decided it was time to get the police involved. Considering how small of a town Leeton is, it didn't take long at all for word of Stephanie's disappearance to spread like wildfire. Social media posts were made and shared around with locals, and one missing person post was shared more than 1,500 times. Rumors began to spread around town, with many people even suspecting that Aaron may have been involved. When looking at photos of Stephanie, she just fills you with this feeling of innocence, happiness, and compassion. So who could have possibly done something like this? Aaron answered every question he received from journalists with complete honesty, patience, and sincerity, even when the questions were clearly directed at his own potential involvement. Aaron never once changed his story. All he ever did was beg for Stephanie to return home or to call him as soon as she could, but this call never came. The Scott family began to wonder if Stephanie may have gotten into some sort of terrible car accident. This is because, at this point, her car had never been located. A few days after her disappearance, her family arranged for various agencies to conduct air and water searches in the surrounding areas, but all of these searches turned up no evidence. Dive teams searched nearby canals, ditches, and water channels. Volunteers searched nature trails and roadsides, but there were no clues found that would indicate where Stephanie had gone. But after a few days had passed, investigators made a breakthrough. Detectives announced that they'd located Stephanie's car in a field about 11 kilometers outside of Leeton. The car was totally out of place, being parked a short distance away from a trail that was surrounded in tall grass. The only problem was, Stephanie still wasn't found. She wasn't in the car, and there was no indication of how the car could have ended up here in the first place. Aaron and the rest of Stephanie's family were now forced to the realization that Stephanie had most likely not left her car there of her own free will. She had been kidnapped. What's interesting about Stephanie's school, Leeton High School, is that the school seems to have had remarkably tight security. The school was surrounded by 2 steel gates, each with its own lock so that no one could get in without a key, and these keys were only held by approved personnel. On the day that Stephanie disappeared, one of her colleagues from the school showed up to let her into the school. Both gates had been locked as it was a Sunday, and no other members of the faculty were present outside of the usual weekend cleaning crew. After Stephanie made it past both locked gates, she headed towards the English teacher's staff room so that she could get started on her lesson plans. She remained there for about 2 hours and 40 minutes before deciding it was time to go home for the day. She then packed up her things and headed for the exit, walking along an interior hallway and calling out to one of the cleaning crew members as she left, shouting for him to have a happy Easter and that she would see him on Monday. A few moments later, Stephanie made it to the exit of the building, which was locked. She stopped just inside the doorway so that she could grab the keys out of her purse. But as soon as she looked down, she was grabbed from behind, with someone forcing their hand over her mouth so that she couldn't scream. Stephanie fought back very aggressively, clawing at him, screaming the best she could, and fighting every step of the way. She scratched at the criminal's face but couldn't get a good enough grip to allow herself to break free. The assailant easily overpowered Stephanie, prying her away from the door and dragging her to a photography room just a short distance away. This room had been used as a dark room for the photography department, allowing them to develop photos for their assignments. Stephanie continued to fight, but it was all in vain. The assailant, still holding her from behind, closed the door behind themselves, then shoved Stephanie onto the ground, with her landing face down with some serious force. She continued to fight even after all this had taken place, but her best efforts simply weren't enough. Her attacker fiercely laid into her, hitting her a total of 40 times directly in the face. After about 40 or 50 seconds, detectives say that she most likely fell unconscious. The attacker then did the unthinkable and took advantage of Stephanie while she was incapacitated. The unknown assailant then pulled out a weapon and ended Stephanie's life right there in the darkroom of the high school. But here's where things get particularly crazy. If you remember, Stephanie wasn't alone in the school that day. According to school records, there was one other person in the school with her, a man who worked for the school cleaning crew. 24-year-old Vincent Stanford had been working at the school for quite a while, being one of their most popular janitors. Vincent lived at home with his mother and brother, and seeing as how he was likely the last person to have seen Stephanie before she vanished, police wanted to ask him a few questions to better understand her last known movements. Police spoke with Vincent on a couple occasions, but for reasons that remain unclear, they began to grow a bit suspicious of him. They asked for permission to search his home, and it seems that Vincent and his family agreed. This would prove to be a critical mistake for Vincent. As they searched his room, police found a set of keys that looked strikingly similar to a set of keys that Stephanie used to carry. But things were about to get far, far worse for Vincent. Police soon asked to take a look at Vincent's phone, and that's when they found the most disturbing piece of evidence thus far. A photo that Vincent had taken that showed a burnt crime scene, as well as a human body that they had a strong belief may have belonged to Stephanie. Why Vincent would have left images like this on his phone is beyond me. Why he held on to Stephanie's keys doesn't make any sense either. I guess he must have been keeping them as a trophy or something. Needless to say, police knew without a doubt Vincent was involved in Stephanie's disappearance. But don't click away just yet, because that's only the tip of the iceberg. As police continued to interview Vincent about the crime, they would learn just how twisted and disturbed this man really was. As police continued to speak with Vincent, he quickly realized that he had nowhere left to run. He gave police a haphazard excuse about why he had such strange and disturbing photos on his phone, but his excuses were very clearly lies. Police had also uncovered a set of blood-stained handcuffs in his bedroom, so it was pretty obvious what had taken place here. But the details of the crime, and the crime that Vincent had planned for the future, are two of the most shocking details about this case. Investigators say that after being confronted with so much condemning evidence, Vincent gave up and confessed to the murder of Stephanie Scott. When police asked him to explain how the crime had taken place, well, that's when things got extremely creepy, to put it lightly. Vincent confessed to everything we discussed just a moment ago, grabbing her from behind, tossing her into the photography darkroom, then ending her life while she was unconscious. But after he had done this, Vincent explained that he dropped his knife on the darkroom floor, got up, and went home. He made himself a cheese sandwich, poured himself a cup of coffee, and enjoyed a nice meal before heading back to the school to clean up after himself. He casually picked up all the items that had been dropped by Stephanie during the struggle, including her car keys. He then picked Stephanie up, placed her on a plastic tarp in the trunk of her own car, then headed back into the school to finish cleaning. He says that he used a pressure washer to clean the scene of the crime, then hopped into her car and drove back to his own home. He parked Stephanie's car behind a shed in his own backyard, then walked back to the school to pick up his own car. Once he arrived at the school, he got his car and decided to head back inside to remove some of the floorboards from the darkroom to better conceal his crime. This timeline was confirmed by a police officer who picked up Vincent's car on his dash cam at around 3:35 p.m. that afternoon. A while later, he got back into Stephanie's car and drove to a local gas station, filling up a gas container and then getting back into Stephanie's car. This scene was later picked up on CCTV cameras, confirming the story that Vincent had told investigators. The next day, April 6th, Vincent drove Stephanie's car once again, this time to Cocapara National Park, between 50 and 70 kilometers from the high school. He placed her body on the ground alongside various pieces of evidence from the scene of the crime, and potentially condemning items found in Stephanie's car. He covered Stephanie and all of the items in gasoline, then lit a fire and drove away. While driving Stephanie's car, he dumped various items in trash cans along his drive back towards Leeton. None of these items were ever recovered by police, as they'd already been taken to various landfills by the time police arrived to investigate. When police carried out additional searches of Vincent's home after he had admitted to the crime, they came across a strange notebook that included various details about a local girl believed to be about 12 years old. When police questioned Vincent about these notebooks, he didn't even try to lie. He admitted that he'd been stalking a local girl and she was planned to be his next victim. Upon further interviews, Vincent would admit that he'd had violent thoughts since he was about 8 years old. He often thought about what it would be like to end someone's life. And Stephanie just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Vincent finally saw his opportunity to act on his twisted fantasies. Stephanie was a bright, loving young woman who was stolen from the world far too soon. Stephanie had so much to offer to her students, but this worthless lump of human waste stole her from her family, her beloved fiance, and her students before her life had really even begun. In the years since the crime, Vincent was naturally sentenced to life in prison. Her family filed charges against the New South Wales Education Department, as well as the cleaning company in charge of Vincent. A private settlement was reached, but this did nothing to ease the pain that Stephanie's family will hold on to for the rest of their lives. Aaron, Stephanie's fiance, eventually found love again and became engaged to someone in 2021, doing his best to heal from the unforgettable trauma that he was forced into. Stephanie's life may have been tragically cut short, but the only silver lining to this story, if there even is one, is that the investigation helped to shut down yet another monster prowling the streets, and thankfully may have saved the life of that 12-year-old girl that was next on Vincent's list.